This should terrify you if you understand anything about how global power actually functions in the 21st century. 12 commercial vessels, $12 billion in ships and cargo, 40 Russian naval units operating in synchronized movements across 3 separate ocean zones, all of it executed in a matter of weeks. Ships that left port as routine commercial operations now sit detained in Russian facilities. But what matters isn't just what happened. What matters is that this was not a spontaneous act of aggression. This was deliberate, this was planned, this was precise. And the most unsettling part of all, we gave them the instruction manual. Let me walk you through what unfolded across the maritime approaches to Russia during these past several weeks. Russian naval forces, acting with operational coordination that would impress any military strategist, conducted parallel seizures of petroleum tankers and liquefied natural gas carriers, Black Sea operations, Baltic corridor interdictions, Arctic route interceptions, all happening at once, vessels operating under American oversight, Allied commercial flagships, every one of them escorted into Russian territorial custody under legal arguments constructed with such meticulous detail that Western legal teams are still working through the precedents and justifications being cited. The immediate response from capitals across Europe and North America followed a predictable script: outrage, emergency diplomatic consultations, stern warnings about repercussions. But I have spent enough time observing how American policymakers respond to global events to recognize authentic surprise when I see it. And this time, the surprise was genuine. That reality should unsettle you far more than the vessel seizures themselves. It reveals that our strategic forecasting completely failed to predict what anyone seriously studying Russian behavior patterns should have anticipated. Our entire framework for understanding their decision-making proved inadequate. Now, I want you to question something you almost certainly believe to be true. You probably assume that international maritime law creates genuine protection for commercial shipping. Yes, those legal frameworks exist. Yes, they are codified in multilateral agreements that virtually every nation on Earth has formally accepted. But legal frameworks only function when parties are willing to enforce them consistently. And when enforcement itself gets weaponized as a tool of statecraft, those rules stop being neutral protections. They become instruments of power. This story does not actually begin in recent weeks. The real starting point was late 2022. The Western response to Russia's military operations in Ukraine included what policymakers described as the most far-reaching sanctions architecture ever constructed: swift network expulsion, sovereign wealth fund asset seizures, and most significantly, for what would follow, the petroleum price ceiling mechanism. That system was engineered to permit Russian oil exports to continue flowing into global markets while simultaneously capping prices at levels calculated to drain Moscow's revenue streams that fund military operations. From the perspective of officials in Washington and Brussels, this seemed elegant, nuanced, strategically sophisticated. From Moscow's vantage point, this represented Western powers claiming unilateral authority to set the terms under which global energy commerce would operate. Russia could sell its petroleum reserves, but only at valuations determined by its adversaries. And compliance with that system would be enforced through Western dominance over shipping insurance markets, maritime logistics networks, and international financial clearing systems. The implicit message could not have been clearer: violate the terms we have established, and your vessels will not operate. For nearly 24 months, Russia absorbed this economic pressure while methodically constructing alternatives to Western-controlled systems. They redirected petroleum exports toward Asian markets. They developed Arctic shipping infrastructure at a pace that exceeded most intelligence assessments of what was feasible. They engineered financial settlement mechanisms designed to function independently of Western banking architecture. These were not simply reactive economic adaptations. These were preparations for operating in a global system where Russian energy exports would no longer require Western approval or infrastructure. But something shifted in late 2024 that converted preparation into operational action. United States naval forces alongside Allied maritime units began conducting boardings and inspections of tankers suspected of transporting Russian petroleum in violation of the price cap regulations. These interdictions were not occurring in Russian territorial waters, but in international maritime zones where freedom of navigation principles should have provided protection. The stated justification was sanctions enforcement. The operational reality was that economic warfare had evolved into physical interdiction. Moscow's response followed a systematic pattern. They documented each boarding incident, each assertion of Western authority over vessels that Russia characterized as legitimate commercial operations. They cataloged the legal precedents being established. And then in mid-December, the catalyzing incident occurred. An American-operated tanker collided with a Russian scientific research vessel in northern waters. Multiple Russian crew members died in the incident. Washington characterized it as a regrettable accident. Moscow alleged the tanker was carrying sophisticated surveillance technology beyond standard commercial equipment. They demanded the vessel return to Russian jurisdiction for criminal investigation. When the ship declined to comply, Russia formally declared the crew fugitives from legal proceedings. Whether you find Moscow's account credible or Washington's version more persuasive is almost irrelevant to what matters here. Russia had constructed a legal architecture, however disputed and contentious, that provided justification for what would come next. By framing the collision as a criminal matter rather than a military incident, they created a procedural pathway for actions that could be presented as legitimate law enforcement rather than acts of military aggression. The seizures that followed were anything but impulsive. Russian naval forces executed synchronized operations across multiple maritime theaters, boarding and directing 12 vessels into Russian-controlled ports. The crews, hundreds of individuals who began their work shifts as ordinary commercial mariners, found their status abruptly reclassified as material witnesses in ongoing criminal proceedings, not hostages in technical legal terminology, but functionally they have become bargaining assets in a geopolitical confrontation they never chose to participate in. What Russia has accomplished is challenging the core assumption that makes modern global commerce function. That assumption holds that commercial maritime operations exist in a protected sphere governed by international law, insulated from military conflicts between great powers. Even during the decades of Cold War confrontation between superpowers, that principle remained largely intact. Russia has now deliberately shattered that norm, using precisely the strategic playbook that Western powers demonstrated for them. Consider the underlying logic. If American naval forces can conduct vessel boardings under the authority of sanctions enforcement, even in international waters, then what prevents Russia from doing exactly the same under different legal justifications? If Western-controlled systems can be weaponized to enforce price controls on commodities, then what prevents Russia from leveraging its regional military advantages to enforce its own interpretations of maritime security requirements? This represents strategic mirroring. Russia is compelling Western decision-makers to grapple with an uncomfortable reality. Can you sustain a system where you dictate operational rules on a global scale but face no equivalent vulnerability yourselves? The human consequences are already accumulating. Those crew members currently in Russian custody are real people with families waiting for them, with mortgage obligations, with lives that have been completely disrupted by policy decisions made in government offices thousands of miles from where they work. When major powers treat commercial activity as merely another domain of warfare, ordinary individuals absorb the costs before anyone else does. And here's what genuinely concerns me about where this leads. The precedent being established extends far beyond the bilateral relationship between Russia and the United States. If this operational logic becomes normalized, maritime shipping enters an entirely new epoch of structural vulnerability. Virtually every commercial vessel operating today carries electronic systems that a hostile state could characterize as surveillance technology. Environmental compliance regulations are written broadly enough to justify nearly any inspection regime. The distinction between legitimate security enforcement and economic hostage-taking becomes perilously unclear. China is monitoring these developments with intense interest. Iran is as well. Every regional power that resents Western maritime dominance is taking notes. They are running calculations about whether Western nations possess sufficient resolve to protect every commercial vessel that might become a target in future scenarios. More critically, they are learning that when foundational institutional norms begin fracturing, the breakdown accelerates faster than conventional wisdom predicts. This is the mechanism through which international orders deteriorate, not through dramatic catastrophic collapses, but through incremental erosion of shared understandings about what constitutes acceptable state behavior. Each violation that passes without effective response establishes a new baseline for what is permissible. Each precedent makes subsequent escalations easier to rationalize. We are observing that deterioration process happening in real time right now. Energy markets have already internalized these lessons. Insurance premiums for maritime operations near Russian-controlled waters have increased dramatically. Certain shipping routes have become effectively uninsurable, which renders them commercially unviable regardless of demand. Investment capital is migrating away from integrated global supply chains toward fragmented regional systems that incorporate geopolitical risk calculations at every transaction point. For Europe, which depends on energy logistics that frequently transit zones under Russian influence or control, this represents a strategic crisis. Companies that believed they had successfully diversified away from direct Russian dependencies are discovering that their alternative supply chains remain exposed to these same vulnerabilities. The economic costs will accumulate gradually but inexorably. Here is the profound irony embedded in all of this. The sanctions architecture designed to isolate Russia economically has, through its own enforcement mechanisms, created the conditions for Russia to demonstrate an entirely different category of power, not the capacity to compete with Western financial systems on their own terms, but the capability to impose costs, to generate instability, to force adversaries to operate under conditions of permanent strategic uncertainty. This is not evidence of Russian strength in any conventional sense. This is desperation being packaged as strategic innovation. But desperate powers are frequently the most dangerous precisely because they have calculated they have less to lose from further escalation. Russia has accepted that it cannot prevail in a competition conducted according to Western established rules. So the strategy has shifted to changing those rules entirely, or at minimum, making adherence to them so costly that other nations begin questioning whether the rules serve their interests. What should disturb us most profoundly is not Russia's actions themselves, but our own institutional failure to anticipate them. For 2 full years, we imposed economic pressure through mechanisms that inherently required physical enforcement capabilities. We conducted vessel boardings, we froze financial assets held in Western institutions, we dictated commodity pricing structures, and we operated under the assumption that our adversaries would simply absorb these costs without developing countermeasures or responses. That assumption was not strategy. That was wishful thinking disguised as sophisticated policy analysis. The fundamental question we face now is whether this becomes an isolated shock that forces strategic recalibration, or whether this marks the beginning of an extended pattern where commercial shipping gets routinely targeted as a standard tool of geopolitical competition. The answer depends entirely on choices that have not yet been made. Diplomatic negotiation could establish clearer operational boundaries that all parties understand. Continued escalation could normalize the seizure of commercial assets as routine practice in great power rivalry. We are entering a historical period where the baseline assumptions that have governed international commerce for generations no longer apply, where economic warfare and military capabilities are functionally inseparable, where every major maritime corridor becomes a potential theater in conflicts that have no defined boundaries or endpoints. The 12 vessels currently sitting in Russian custody are not simply ships. They function as markers of a transformation that will fundamentally reshape the architecture of global trade for years into the future. They represent the precise moment when the international system's fragile normative structure fractured under the pressure of great power competition, and they serve as a warning that the institutional order we assumed was stable and enduring was always far more precarious than we permitted ourselves to acknowledge. Pay attention to what unfolds from here. Stay informed, stay engaged, because what happens in the coming months will determine whether we can construct some new framework for predictable commercial operations, or whether we slide into a world where raw power rather than legal principles determines which vessels can sail freely and which ones end up seized and detained in foreign ports.